In Sarasota, Florida, average rent collapsed more than 40% in a single year. Sarasota, a place people talked about like it had a force field around it. Unbeatable, unaffordable forever, like the beach itself was charging a monthly subscription. So let's address the bedtime story you've been sold. Rents only go up. You missed your chance. If you didn't sign in 2021, just accept your fate and get a roommate named inflation. Yeah, these 10 cities just put that myth in a headlock. Because when a market gets flooded with new apartments, and demand isn't sprinting anymore, prices do what prices are supposed to do. They come down. Not politely, not slowly. They drop. And the funniest part is watching the power dynamic flip. Landlords in these markets went from take it or leave it to, so, what if we do 2 free months, covered parking and a dog spa? It's like they're negotiating with you the way a struggling cable company negotiates when you try to cancel. Next, they'll offer free Wi-Fi, free yoga, and a handwritten apology note. If you've ever said, I'll move when rent finally comes down, this might actually be your window. Not in every city, not for every building, but in these specific places the leverage has shifted, and you can feel it in the listings. Here's what we're doing today. We're counting down 10 U.S. cities where rents have crashed the hardest. We're talking real declines in key markets, big concessions, and now leasing banners multiplying like weeds. You know that moment when a neighborhood goes from waitlist only to please tour today? That's the vibe. And no, this isn't based on vibes alone. This is pulled from real rent trackers and market data. The unsexy stuff. The stuff that doesn't care about your favorite influencers, top cities to move to real. Numbers don't get sponsored. Numbers don't do manifesting. Why does this matter right now? Because this shift is happening right now. The deals show up when supply is hitting, when units are sitting, and when landlords start competing instead of dictating. But that window doesn't stay open forever. Once those buildings fill up, or builders slow down, or demand comes roaring back, the freebies disappear and the take it or leave it energy returns. Now here's the promise. You'll see exactly where the numbers say opportunity is, not where the hype says it is. We're separating actually cheaper from just loud online. You'll also know which places are cheap for a good reason, like a genuine supply surge, and which places are cheap for a scary reason, like shaky jobs, rising costs outside of rent, or a city that's losing steam. And by the end, you'll have a short list. Spots worth researching if you want to save real money. And spots to avoid if you don't want your discount to come with a side of regret. If you like real estate reality checks without the sugarcoating, hit subscribe. Now let's start the countdown with number 10, the place that got humbled first. Number 10, Jacksonville, Florida. Jacksonville spent a few years acting like a discount Miami. Same sunshine energy. Same we're up next attitude. But then the rent chart pulled up like a bouncer and said, relax, you're the one that's actually on sale. Right now, average rent is lower than the peak. The exact number depends on the tracker and the building class. But the direction is the story. Down. Not slowing down. Down. It feels like the market rewound a couple of years for new leases, back before every listing came with the attitude of a private island. Quick snapshot. The population is still growing because Florida still pulls people in. But vacancy is higher in a lot of pockets, especially where new apartments open fast. Cost of living is generally below the national average, even though insurance and utilities are doing their best to ruin the math. The job base is practical: logistics, healthcare, the military, port work, and warehouses. And crime is a bit higher than average, with some areas improving and others still rough. Here's why this is happening. Developers built hard during the Sun Belt boom, assuming demand would stay on turbo forever. Then migration cooled from the pandemic peak while thousands of new units hit at once. When supply shows up and demand isn't sprinting, landlords have to compete. Add higher insurance and general cost pressure, and some renters double up or move farther out. What does it feel like? Now leasing banners on buildings that should have wait lists. Leasing offices acting like they remember your name. New arrivals are budget-minded families and remote workers looking for space. Some priced-out locals and service workers drift toward cheaper suburbs or other southern metros. But there's a catch. You earn that lower rent in humidity, sprawl, and a lifestyle that basically assumes you and your car are married. And yes, it's cheaper, but your air conditioning bill will have opinions. Picture this, you pay a couple hundred less a month and finally get a second bedroom, not a flex space. You walk past multiple now leasing signs and realize you hold the leverage. If you think Jacksonville is on sale, wait for number 9, a Midwest workhorse quietly rolling prices back. Number 9, Columbus, Ohio. Columbus never had the "I'm so expensive" attitude. It's not out here flexing like a coastal city with a trust fund. But even here, the rent chart is quietly backing down, like it saw the vacancy numbers and decided to stop arguing. Average rent is lower than the peak. Exact numbers vary by tracker and neighborhood, so we're not pretending one figure tells the whole story. But the direction matters, down from where it topped out. In a lot of areas, it feels like someone hit rewind to a couple years ago, back when affordable Midwest wasn't a punchline. Fast snapshot. Columbus keeps growing modestly because it has something rare, jobs plus universities. That steady demand is real. But vacancy is ticking up because new buildings are opening faster than students and fresh grads can fill them. Cost of living is generally below the national average, and housing is doing most of the heavy lifting there. The economy is a practical mix: education, healthcare, state government, finance, and a growing tech and logistics lane. Crime sits close to the national average with the usual split. Some downtown concerns, calmer suburbs, and neighborhoods that depend block by block. Here's why rents are easing. The construction pipeline stayed strong long enough to finally overshoot demand that's steady, not explosive. In-migration cooled a bit, and fewer renters are bidding like it's an auction for the last decent unit on earth. So landlords do what they hate doing: compete. That means move-in bonuses, specials, and a little less chest thumping in leasing emails. What does it feel like on the ground? Some new buildings are pushing perks instead of pretending you should be grateful for a blank wall and a luxury doorknob. New arrivals are students, young professionals, and remote workers escaping coastal rent trauma. Some locals are the ones leaving, either chasing even cheaper small towns or heading somewhere warmer when the gray skies start feeling personal. But there's a catch. Columbus is stable and affordable, but if you need ocean views and a nightlife scene that never sleeps, this isn't that. You're trading sky-high rent for Big Ten winters and a sky that sometimes looks like it's buffering. Picture this. You upgrade from a cramped one-bed to a real two-bed near campus for what used to feel like studio money. And leasing agents actually follow up with you, because they want your application, not just your application fee. Next up, number 8. A city that thought it was invincible because of country music and bachelor parties, until the rent rolled over. Number 8, Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville tried to live like it was on a permanent bachelorette party surge. Like the city's economy ran on cowboy boots, party buses, and we'll just charge more. But the rent data basically said, all right, party's over. Everybody drink some water. Average rent is down from the peak. Exact figures bounce around depending on the tracker and the neighborhood. So we're not pretending one number tells the whole story. But the direction is clear. Rents have eased. And in a city that spent years stacking price hikes like pancakes, even a pullback feels like hitting rewind on a couple years of chaos in one shot. Quick snapshot. Nashville is still growing, just not at that pandemic gold rush pace when everybody decided they needed a new personality and a lower tax bill. Vacancy is rising in those brand new luxury mid-rises, because it turns out you can't build that many rooftop pools and expect infinite tenants to spawn. Cost of living is still above the national average, but housing is finally giving people a little oxygen. The job mix is exactly what you'd expect. Music and entertainment, healthcare, tourism, and corporate offices. Crime is mixed, with some core areas running hotter than the brochures suggest. Here's why it's happening. There was a massive wave of high-end apartment construction chasing boom-era demand. Tourism is still strong, but remote work migration cooled, and some workers moved on when prices got silly. And investors who assumed endless rent growth are now doing the unthinkable, cutting prices and throwing in specials to keep units full. What does it feel like on the ground? Rooftop pools, empty cabanas, and leasing specials on buildings that used to brag about waitlists. The new arrivals are creatives, hospitality workers, and remote folks picking vibes plus value. The people leaving? Some locals who got squeezed so hard they can't justify downtown, even with the recent drop. But there's a catch. Traffic is still traffic. Tourist chaos is still chaos. And a lot of costs outside rent are still rising like they didn't get the memo. Yes, it's cheaper, but you will hear live music and party buses whether you want to or not. Picture this. You finally get a downtown place with an actual bedroom door, not a glorified loft that's basically a stage set. You casually ask for a free month, and the leasing agent flinches, then says yes. That's the sound of leverage changing hands. If Nashville cooling surprises you, number 7 is a Pacific Northwest city that quietly slid from squeezed to negotiable. Number 7, Portland, Oregon. Portland went from "you'll never afford this" to "please don't move to the suburbs just yet" in a few rent reports. That's a wild identity crisis for a city that used to act like high rent was part of the brand, right next to coffee and rain. Average rent is down from its peak. The exact figure changes depending on which tracker you use and which pocket of the metro you're talking about. But the direction is the headline. Down. Think prices closer to what you would have seen a couple of years ago, except now there are more units chasing you instead of you chasing them. Quick snapshot. Population growth has slowed, and in some stretches it's flat or even slightly down after years of strong in-migration. Vacancy is up, especially as downtown demand lost some steam and new projects that were planned during the boom finally hit the market. Cost of living is still above the national average, but rent cuts are starting to chip away at that pain. The job mix is a Portland classic. Tech, manufacturing, shipping, and a big creative services scene. Crime is the complicated part. There are real downtown concerns, some improvements in certain areas, and some issues that just refuse to leave. Here's why this is happening. A chunk of people left for cheaper markets after years of run UPS and non-stop headlines. At the same time, construction that was greenlit during the hot years is finally delivering units, so supply is showing up late to the party but showing up big. Add slower job growth and the fact that remote work lets more people live farther out, and landlords lose that "we're doing you a favor" posture. What does it feel like now? More for rent signs in neighborhoods that used to fill by word of mouth. More listings that sit longer. More leasing agents who suddenly have time to respond like they're paid to do that. New arrivals tend to be remote workers, creatives, and people trading bigger coastal cities for something slightly saner. Who's leaving? Longtime residents tired of the costs, the politics drama, or the downtown conditions. But there's a catch. Cheaper rent doesn't fix gray winters, street-level problems, or the constant civic argument energy. You get a discount, but you also get more rain than your group chat thinks is medically reasonable. Picture this. A bigger apartment with room for a studio or home office for what your cramped one-bed cost a couple of years ago. And instead of begging for the one decent listing, you're actually comparing 2 or 3 options like a normal person. Next up, number 6, where one big campus and a few new buildings were enough to tip the whole market. Number 6, Athens, Ohio. This is the kind of town where one new apartment complex and a slightly smaller freshman class can move the entire rent needle. Big cities need a whole recession. Athens just needs one developer with confidence and a university that sneezes. Average rent is lower than the peak. The exact figure depends on which listings you track and whether you're looking at student-focused buildings or older local units. But the headline is real. Rents have dropped, and it can feel like several years of student housing hikes got erased overnight. In a small market, prices don't ease. They swing. Quick snapshot. Population here stays mostly flat because the heartbeat is the university. Vacancy can look high for a town this size when even a few buildings go half full, and suddenly every landlord feels it. Cost of living is generally below the national average, pushed down by student housing and local wages. The job base is what you'd expect: education, small local services, and healthcare. Crime is generally low, with the usual college town spikes, more late-night mistakes than big city chaos. Here's why it's happening. New student housing and off-campus builds came online and overshot demand. Enrollment trends flattened or dipped a bit. And in a place like this, a bit matters. Landlords who used to rely on guaranteed student demand are now competing on price and perks, because empty bedrooms don't pay mortgages. What does it feel like on the ground? You'll see 1-month free banners at buildings that used to fill on day one of sign UPS. Students can be pickier now. They can compare options instead of taking whatever's left. And you'll also see a few remote workers sniffing around for ultra-low costs and quiet living. The people leaving tend to be older residents and new grads headed to bigger job markets, because Athens is great for a season of life, but it's not a giant career machine. But there's a catch. It's cheap, but it's small. If you need big city energy, this will feel like a very affordable nap. You'll save on rent, but you'll pay in limited nightlife, fewer job lanes, and the reality that the whole economy runs on the school calendar. Picture this. You're paying student housing prices, but you're in a clean, updated unit with your own bathroom and fewer mystery stains. And instead of you chasing landlords are following up with you. In Athens, that's how you know the market flipped. Next up, number 5 shows what happens when a big city tears up its zoning map and actually lets people build. Number 5, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minneapolis is the city that looked around and said, "What if we just built housing?" And now the rent chart is clapping, because nothing scares a rent spike like more apartments. Average rent is down from the peak. The exact number depends on the tracker and the neighborhood, but the direction is the headline. In some areas, it feels like prices rolled back multiple years, like your lease time traveled to the days before everybody started charging, like every unit came with a concierge. Quick snapshot. Population is roughly stable, with normal ups and downs. Vacancy is higher in parts of the market because new apartments keep coming online and they need renters. Cost of living sits around national, sometimes a bit below once cheaper rents do their thing. Jobs are solid and boring in a good way. Healthcare, education, corporate headquarters, and manufacturing. Crime is mixed. There are high-profile concerns, but also pockets improving and neighborhoods that feel totally different a few blocks apart. Here's why it's happening. Pro-housing zoning reforms made it easier to build multifamily. The construction pipeline stayed strong long enough to outpace short-term demand. When supply shows up, renters stop fighting over the same tired stock like it's the last decent listing on earth. Options increase and landlords actually have to compete. What does it feel like now? Brand new mid-rises in walkable neighborhoods offering deals instead of acting like you should be grateful for a tour. New arrivals are young professionals, families, and remote workers chasing city amenities without coastal rent trauma. Some people leave because winters are wintering, and some tap out over neighborhood-specific issues. But there's a catch. It's still cold. No policy reform can fix February. You're trading coastal rent for Midwest winters and the fine art of snowbank parking. Picture this. A modern place near transit for what a tired old walk-up used to cost. You tour multiple good options and ask, "So what can you do on rent?" And they don't laugh. They negotiate. Next up, number 4. A tiny New England capital that quietly flipped its tight market story upside down. Number 4, Providence, Rhode Island. Providence always acted like the little Boston that could. Same brick, same brains, same we're basically next door confidence. But now the rent chart is acting like the little Boston that discounted. Average rent is down from the peak, and in some segments it's close to a 20% swing. That's not a cute dip. That's hitting rewind on multiple years of New England rent creep. Quick snapshot. Modest growth with spillover from Boston. Vacancy is higher than Providence is used to, which means you actually have choices. Cost of living is still above the national average, but it's less brutal when rent stops sprinting. The job base is steady: education, healthcare, design, and smaller finance and services. Crime is mixed but generally manageable with normal small city trade-offs. Here's why it's happening. There's more construction and more converted buildings in what used to be a tight market. Some renters are choosing Boston suburbs or other metros, especially with hybrid work. And landlords are learning you can't charge big city prices if your city doesn't pay big city wages. What does it feel like now? Listings linger instead of vanishing in a weekend. You can compare places, ask questions, and negotiate like a normal human. New arrivals are students, young creatives, and remote workers who want East Coast charm on a discount. Some locals who got priced out earlier are pushing farther out to smaller towns. But there's a catch. It's still a small city, so if you want endless gigs and non-stop flights, you're still taking the train to Boston. You get charm and cheaper rent, but you also get older housing stock and quirky infrastructure. Picture this. A brick and beam loft with roommates for what a cramped Boston one-bed costs. You walk past old mill buildings that now say for lease, and realize you can negotiate. Next up, number 3. A boomtown that thought it graduated into always expensive status until the cranes kept going. Number 3, Austin, Texas. Austin was that kid who looked you dead in the eye and said, "I'm basically San Francisco now." And then the rent data showed up and said, "Relax, you're still Austin." Average rent is down from the peak, and it's also down compared with last year. Exact numbers depend on which tracker you use and whether you're looking at a shiny new tower or an older complex, so we're not locking in one magic figure. But the direction is undeniable. This is a real correction. It's like rolling prices back a couple of intense boom years in one uncomfortable, overdue exhale. Quick snapshot. Austin is still growing, just not at that 2020 to 2022 stampede pace when everybody arrived at once and asked where the best neighborhood is before they learned what a frontage road is. Vacancy is higher in parts of the market, especially in newer Class A buildings, because a lot of brand new units are competing for the same renters. Cost of living is still above the national average, but rent isn't the same choke point it was when every lease renewal felt like a prank. The job base is strong and varied. Tech, government, startups, and a big creative scene. Crime is a mixed urban picture, plus all the side effects of fast growth and gentrification. Here's why it's happening. Austin overbuilt. Cranes everywhere, units delivering in waves, and suddenly supply isn't scarce anymore. At the same time, tech hiring cooled a bit and remote workers started rethinking where they want to live when they don't have to live anywhere. And investors who assumed demand was infinite are now doing something rare. Cutting asking rents and offering concessions to keep occupancy up. What does it feel like on the ground? Every highway seems to have a new apartment complex with a move-in special banner. Leasing offices are friendlier. Replies are faster. The new arrivals are still young professionals who want the scene, but now they've got bargaining power. The people leaving are often tech workers and locals squeezed by property taxes and the overall cost of living, even if rent is finally easing. But there's a catch. Traffic didn't crash with rent. Heat didn't crash with rent. And the cost of everything else did not get the memo. You'll save on the lease, but you'll pay with time in your car and sweat. Picture this, you get a pool, a gym, and in-unit laundry in a building that would have laughed at you 2 years ago. You negotiate 2 months free and actually get it in a hot tech market. That's how you know the leverage shifted. Next up, number 2 shows what happens when a retiree playground or luxury coastal pocket finally runs into the laws of supply and demand. Number 2, smaller Florida retiree coastal market. This is the Florida town that told retirees, buy now or cry later. And then the rent chart started handing out tissues. Not to mock anybody, just to acknowledge reality. When a market prices itself like paradise is guaranteed, the math eventually taps the microphone. Average rent is down from the top. The exact number shifts by neighborhood and by whether it's a year-round lease, a condo, or a seasonal rental. But the direction is clear. The peak era pricing is getting shaved back. In some condos and snowbird rentals, it feels like several winters of price hikes just vanished, like somebody hit undo on a few seasons of greed. Quick snapshot. Population keeps growing because retirees and second home owners still love the lifestyle. But vacancy is up in pockets, especially where new builds and seasonal units sit empty longer than owners expected. Cost of living is still above the national average, and housing is still the main pain point, just slightly less brutal than it was at the top. The local economy is what you'd expect. Retirement services, healthcare, tourism, and local retail. Crime is relatively low, with the usual tourist area issues that come with crowds and short-term visitors. Here's why it's happening. A lot of building was aimed directly at retirees and snowbirds during the boom, assuming demand would be endless and rich forever. Then some higher-income buyers stepped back because rates rose, insurance got spicy, and taxes stopped feeling like background noise. And once landlords realize peak-era rents aren't sustainable, they do the thing they hate most. They cut prices and offer deals. What does it feel like now? More for rent signs. Longer snowbird special ads. More listings sitting instead of disappearing in a weekend. New arrivals are retirees and remote workers timing the market, trying to lock in a cheaper winter base without the peak season tax. Who's leaving? Some locals and seasonal workers who got priced out of ownership, and some investors rotating to the next hot story. But there's a catch. Hurricanes, insurance drama, and seasonal crowds are part of the package. You get your discount and you also get to know your insurer very well. Like, first name basis. Picture this. You pay less than last year for a place with a pool and palm trees, instead of a cramped northern apartment with a view of a parking lot. You actually have options on the water, instead of begging for whatever's left and pretending it's a vibe. If that sounds wild, number one is the Florida market where rent didn't just soften. It went off a cliff. Number 1, Sarasota, Florida. Sarasota was the poster child for "you'll never afford this beach town." The kind of place people talked about like it was gated by vibes alone. Now it's the poster child for what happens when you actually build housing and the hype runs into math. Average rent plunged roughly 40% plus from its recent peak. That's not a typo. That's a full-on price collapse in a market people treated like it was unbeatable, like the zip code came with a permanent shortage coupon. Quick snapshot. Population is still growing, pushed by retirees and more affluent migrants chasing sunshine. But vacancy is way up in parts of the high end, because a wave of new luxury supply hit a market that can only absorb so many expensive units at once. Cost of living is still above the national average, but rent is finally blinking for the first time in years. The local economy is driven by tourism, healthcare, retirement services, and hospitality. Crime is relatively low with the usual tourist area caveats. Here's why it happened. Sarasota went on an aggressive building spree, high-end rentals and condos everywhere. At the same time, demand cooled a bit as some wealthier renters and buyers waited out prices, compared other Florida metros, or simply refused to play peak pricing games. And when policy and permitting allow a real supply surge instead of permanent scarcity, the market stops being a fairy tale and starts behaving like a market. What does it feel like now? You see luxury buildings offering deals that would have been laughed at 2 years ago. The new arrivals are retirees, remote workers, and higher-income households realizing this is a rare moment to get Sarasota without paying peak era. Because we can pricing. Who's leaving? Some service workers and locals who got squeezed during the run-up, plus investors who banked on endless appreciation and are now meeting the concept of competition. But there's a catch. Even with discounts, this is not a cheap town. You're still dealing with hurricanes, insurance drama, and tourist season turning simple errands into a contact sport. It's like getting a luxury car on sale. You still pay luxury prices to maintain it. Picture this, you're paying hundreds less per month for a place with beach access than people were paying at the peak. You walk into a glossy leasing office in a forever expensive beach market, and for once, you know you can negotiate instead of beg. And that's the #1 rent crash city. Proof that when you actually let people build, even the never affordable spots can come back to earth. These places prove one uncomfortable truth. When you actually build housing, rents don't just slow down. They can fall hard. The shortage story sounds good on podcasts, but supply is supply, and numbers don't care about your favorite hot take. And here's the annoying part. Hype and headlines lag behind what the data is already screaming. By the time people admit a market cooled, the deals have already been sitting there, quietly, while everybody argued online. So if you're renting, moving, or investing, follow vacancy, construction, and jobs. Not TikTok trends. Not "this city is the next this city." That's how people end up paying premium prices for yesterday's narrative. And remember, this discount window won't stay open forever. Once builders slam the brakes or demand snaps back, the freebies disappear. Now tell me, which of these cities would you actually move to for the discount? What's rent doing where you live? Still climbing, flat, or finally cracking? And which city is next and should be in the next episode? If this saved you from a dumb move or pointed you to a smarter one, hit like. Subscribe to MrState Realities for more data, fewer delusions. And turn on notifications so you catch the next market shift before the gurus update their thumbnails.